My daughter gifted me a box of Cuban cigars for my 62nd birthday. When she called asking how I liked them, I told her I'd given them to her father-in-law. The silence was deafening. Then she screamed, "You did what? Those were for you!" That's when I knew something was very wrong. Sarah hadn't remembered my birthday in 3 years, and now suddenly expensive cigars? If you want to know what she was really up to, please stay with me. And if stories like this interest you, please consider subscribing. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, my 62nd birthday. The delivery guy barely looked up when I signed for it, probably his 100th stop that day. But for me, seeing Sarah's name as the sender made me freeze right there on my porch. I actually had to read it twice. Sarah hadn't sent me anything, not even a card, in the 3 years since Margaret died. Hell, she hadn't even called on my birthday last year. Just a quick text that said, "HBD Dad," like I was some acquaintance from her college days. Now, here was this heavy box with her return address, wrapped in that fancy shipping paper that costs extra. I stood there holding that package, and suddenly I was remembering Sarah at 7 years old, saving her allowance for 3 months to buy me a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Dad." She'd wrapped it in newspaper comics, so proud of herself. That little girl used to wait by the window for me to come home from work, would run out barefoot even in winter just to hug me first. Where did that child go? When exactly did she become this stranger who abbreviated happy birthday to 3 letters? The weight of the package brought me back to the present. Whatever was inside, it wasn't wrapped in comic strips. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, sat a box of Cohiba Behaik cigars. Now, I'm no expert, but I've been around long enough to know these weren't your corner store cigars. We're talking about $2,000 worth of Cuban perfection. The kind of cigars lawyers light up after winning big cases, or CEOs pass around when they close deals that make the news. Not the kind of gift a daughter who works part-time at a dental office sends her retired father. I held one up to the light, admiring the perfect wrapper, and that's when the phone rang. Sarah's name lit up my screen, and I'll admit, maybe I smiled a little. Maybe she was finally coming around. "Dad, happy birthday!" Her voice was bright, almost too bright, like she'd practiced this call in the mirror. "Did you get my package?" I told her yes. Thanked her for the generous gift. "You deserve it, Dad. You really do. After everything you've done for our family. Make sure you enjoy them yourself, okay? They're specifically for you." That last part struck me as odd. Why would she need to specify that? But I brushed it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid, looking for problems where there weren't any. That's what happens when you live alone too long. You start second-guessing every little thing. But still, something in her voice reminded me of when she was 16, trying to explain why she'd crashed the car. That same forced brightness covering something darker. After the call, I sat in my kitchen, staring at those cigars. The kitchen Margaret and I had renovated together 15 years ago, where she'd insisted on that expensive marble countertop I'd grumbled about, but now couldn't imagine living without. The house felt especially empty on birthdays. 7 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a formal dining room that seated 12, and me rattling around like a ghost. I looked at the chairs around that dining table. 11 empty seats that used to hold family, friends, laughter. Now just dust collectors. Margaret's chair still had her reading glasses on the arm, like she'd just stepped away for a moment 3 years ago. I thought about lighting one of those cigars right then, but it felt wrong somehow. Wasteful. That's when I remembered Frank, Sarah's father-in-law. Good man, Frank. He'd been checking on me every few weeks since Margaret passed, more than my own daughter had done. We'd sit on his porch sometimes, share a beer, talk about nothing important. He'd appreciate these cigars. I drove over to Frank's place that afternoon, the cigars on my passenger seat like they were made of gold. His house was smaller than mine, modest but well-kept, the kind of place where people actually lived instead of just existed. No empty chairs collecting dust. "Tom," he called out when he saw me walking up his driveway. "What brings you by?" I showed him the box, told him about Sarah's gift, offered to share. His face did something strange then, a flicker of concern, maybe, or confusion. He examined those cigars like they might explode, turning the box over in his hands. "Tom," he said slowly, not meeting my eyes, "Sarah came by last week. Asked to borrow $500,000. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. $500,000. I nearly laughed, but Frank's expression stopped me. He was serious. Said it was for an investment opportunity, something about Michael's business. I told her I didn't have that kind of money lying around. She seemed desperate, Tom. Real desperate. Started crying. Said something about time running out. Michael, my son-in-law. The man who'd swept Sarah off her feet with promises of grand business ventures that never quite materialized. The man who called me Tom, now instead of Dad, like he used to. The man who hadn't looked me in the eye at last Christmas dinner. I looked down at those beautiful, expensive cigars, and suddenly they felt heavier in my hands. Maybe I wasn't being paranoid after all. Frank poured us both coffee. The strong black stuff that could wake the dead. We sat on his porch, the cigars between us unopened, like evidence at a crime scene. "There's more," he said, stirring sugar into his cup, slowly, deliberately. "Sarah and Michael have been looking at properties near that new resort development. Big houses, Tom. $1-million houses. The realtor's a friend of mine. Mentioned they were pre-approved for a loan that made no sense, given what I know about their finances. I knew the development he meant, about 40 minutes north, where tech money was turning farmland into golf courses. How would they afford that? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. Frank just shrugged, but his eyes told me everything. They were planning something. And those cigars, that birthday gift after years of silence, was just the opening move. The call came the next morning while I was fixing the garage door that had been sticking since last winter. Same garage door I'd installed myself 20 years ago, back when I could work all day and not feel it in my bones. Sarah's voice exploded through the phone before I could even say hello. "Dad, how could you give away those cigars? They were specifically for you. They had—" "Never mind. Just never mind." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my garage, wrench still in my hand, grease under my fingernails, trying to make sense of her rage. In 35 years of being her father, I'd heard her angry plenty of times. But this was different. This was panic dressed up as anger. This was fear. What was so special about those particular cigars that they had to stay with me? An hour later, Michael showed up at my door unannounced. First time he'd been to the house in maybe 6 months. "Hey, Tom," he said, already pushing past me into the house. His cologne was too strong, trying to cover something. Maybe alcohol, maybe desperation. "Just need to grab something from the office. Sarah left some papers here last time." There was no last time. Sarah hadn't been to the house in months, but I let him in, watched as he went straight to my study, to the filing cabinet where I kept all the important documents, including the deed to the house, my will, Margaret's death certificate, our wedding certificate from 42 years ago. He was rifling through papers like a man looking for a winning lottery ticket he'd dropped. "What papers exactly?" I asked. He mumbled something about tax documents, but his hands were shaking. That's when I noticed he looked terrible. Bags under his eyes, stubble that was more neglect than style. The confident businessman facade was cracking. I'd seen that look before, on job sites when contractors knew they were about to go under. After Michael left empty-handed and frustrated, nearly slamming the door behind him, I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson. She's one of those women who knows everything that happens on our street. Been living here since the 1970s. Still tends the same rose garden her late husband planted. "Oh, Tom," she said, when I asked if she'd seen Sarah around. "Your daughter's been by at least 3 times in the past month. Always when you're at your doctor's appointments or grocery shopping on Thursdays. She had a key, so I figured you knew. 3 times. Coming to my house when she knew I'd be gone." I hung up and went straight to my study. Everything looked normal at first glance, but when you live in a house for 30 years, you know when things have been moved. The filing cabinet drawer wasn't quite closed right. Papers in my desk were neater than I'd left them. Someone had been searching for something, trying to put everything back but not quite managing it. That evening, I decided to check something that had been nagging at me. Inside the cigar box, beneath the velvet lining, my fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. A small, flat piece of plastic, no bigger than a coin. I'd spent enough time with my grandson Tommy playing with his spy toys to recognize a GPS tracker when I saw one. My own daughter had bugged a gift to track my movements. I actually had to sit down when I realized what this meant. The birthday present, the sudden interest in my well-being, it was all surveillance. But surveillance for what? What were they planning that required knowing exactly where I was? I thought about all the times recently I'd felt like someone was watching me. Dismissed it as old age paranoia. Turns out paranoia is just pattern recognition when you don't have all the facts yet. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at Margaret's computer, the one we used to share for emails and looking up recipes. She'd bookmarked so many cooking sites, always trying to perfect her mother's lasagna recipe. Never did get it quite right, but I'd give anything to taste her almost right version again. Sarah must have forgotten we shared an email account years ago for family stuff. The password hadn't changed. Margaret's birthday and our anniversary combined. There in the trash folder, not quite deleted, was an email from Sarah to someone named Dr. Wilson. Re-evaluation schedule, the subject line read. The message was brief but devastating. Plan B if he doesn't cooperate. Dr. Wilson is ready to do the assessment. Once we have the diagnosis, we can move forward with the guardianship. My hands were actually shaking as I read it. Guardianship. They were trying to have me declared incompetent. The daughter I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd walked down the aisle, who'd cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart, was now plotting to have me declared mentally unfit. I kept reading, finding more emails, fragments of a conversation about the timeline and liquid assets and power of attorney documents. One mentioned that Michael owed $800,000 to the wrong people and had 30 days to pay. Suddenly, the expensive cigars, the GPS tracker, the snooping through my papers, it all made horrible sense. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were planning to take everything, and they were going to use my own mental state against me to do it. I printed everything, my old printer wheezing and complaining, but doing the job. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet house, like I was announcing my discovery to invisible watchers. Then I found more, so much more. Emails about maximizing value, and quick liquidation, and finding buyers in advance. My daughter was pre-selling my life while I was still living it. The family photos on my desk seemed to mock me. All those smiling faces at graduations, weddings, birthdays. Had it all been a lie? Or had something fundamental broken when Margaret died? Something that turned love into greed. Frank called while I was still processing everything. "Tom, you need to know something else," he said, his voice low like he was afraid of being overheard. "Sarah asked me about nursing homes yesterday. Specifically, she wanted to know about that place, Sunset Gardens, where they put Bill Henderson last year. The one his kids stuck him in before they sold his house." Sunset Gardens. I knew it. Everyone our age knew it. It was where families put parents they wanted to forget about. Bill had gone in walking and talking, came out 6 months later in a box. She said she was just curious, research for a friend. But Tom, she had brochures. Multiple brochures. And she'd highlighted the memory care unit prices. The phone felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my hand. My daughter wasn't just planning to take my assets. She was planning to make me disappear entirely, locked away in some facility while she and Michael liquidated everything Margaret and I had built over 40 years of marriage, everything we'd saved for our family's future. Tommy's birthday party was the following weekend. My grandson turning 10 at that cosmic speed that makes you wonder where time really goes. Sarah had texted me the details. Not called. Just a message with an address and time like I was the plumber coming to fix a leak. But I went anyway because Tommy's a good kid, and it wasn't his fault his parents were whatever they were becoming. The party was at one of those pizza places where kids run wild and parents drink overpriced beer. I brought Tommy a model airplane kit, the kind you actually have to build with your hands, not just snap together. The same kind my father had given me when I turned 10, back when building something meant something. He hugged me tight when he saw it, and for a moment everything felt normal. Then he said something that changed everything. Mom says you won't be around much longer anyway, so I should enjoy today. Just like that. Casual as commenting on the weather, this 10-year-old boy had revealed more than all my snooping had. I kept my face neutral, ruffled his hair, told him I wasn't going anywhere. But inside I was calculating. Sarah stood across the room, watching us, and when our eyes met, she looked away fast. Too fast. I spent the rest of that party observing. Really observing. Michael was on his phone constantly, stepping outside every few minutes, coming back looking more stressed each time. At one point I followed him, watched from the window as he stood by his car, arguing with someone on the phone. "I need more time," he was saying. "You'll get your money, just give me another month." When he turned around and saw me watching, his face went white. We stood there, separated by glass and so much more, until he broke eye contact and came back inside. Monday morning, I called Pat Murphy. Pat and I went way back, worked construction together in the 80s before he became a private investigator. "I need you to look into my son-in-law," I told him. Discreet, professional, and fast. Pat didn't ask why. Good investigators never do. 3 days later, he called me back. "Tom, you sitting down? Michael owes $800,000 to some very unpleasant people. Sports betting, poker, the whole 9 yards. He's been moving money through shell companies, trying to stay afloat. The kind of people he owes? They don't send polite reminders. I followed him yesterday, Tom. He met with 2 men in a parking garage downtown. Big guys, the kind who break things professionally. Michael was crying by the end of it. $800,000. Suddenly, Sarah's desperation made sense. But knowing the why didn't make the what any easier to swallow. Pat had more. "Your daughter's been busy too. She visited Sunset Gardens 3 times last month. Had a tour, filled out preliminary paperwork. Tom, she listed you as the prospective resident." I stared at the old coffee maker Margaret and I had bought 20 years ago. Still working. Still making the same bitter brew she used to complain about, but never wanted to replace. My daughter was shopping for my prison while I was fixing her childhood bicycle in the garage just last month. The pink one I'd taught her to ride. "There's more," Pat continued. "The admission forms? They have your signature. Except you never signed them, did you?" I hadn't. Of course I hadn't. My own daughter had forged my signature to lock me away. That afternoon I decided to see Sunset Gardens for myself. Told them I was looking for a place for my brother. The smell hit you first. Disinfectant trying to cover something worse. The receptionist was all fake smiles and rehearsed sympathy. The residents sat in wheelchairs along the hallway like abandoned cars, some talking to people who weren't there, others just staring at nothing. The memory care unit Sarah had highlighted was essentially a locked ward. No visitors without approval, no phone calls without supervision. One man kept asking everyone who passed when his son was coming. "Tomorrow," the nurses would say. Always tomorrow. I left that place feeling like I'd seen my own future if I didn't act fast. That afternoon, I went through the house more carefully, looking for what else had been disturbed. In the desk drawer where I kept Margaret's jewelry, the one Sarah must have thought had valuable pieces, I found something interesting. A business card for Dr. Elena Chen, geriatric psychiatrist, specializing in competency evaluations. The card had notes on the back in Sarah's handwriting. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Assessment appointment scheduled. Tuesday. Tomorrow. They had scheduled an appointment to have me evaluated without my knowledge. I actually laughed out loud at that one. Bitter and short. How exactly were they planning to get me there? Tell me we were going for ice cream? I started documenting everything. The old Polaroid camera Margaret loved still had film in it, so I photographed the forged documents, the business card, everything. Old habits from my construction days kicked in. You always document before you demolish, and something was definitely about to be demolished here. I also went to the bank just to check. The teller, young kid named Marcus, who always called me Mr. Tom, looked uncomfortable when I asked about recent activity. "There have been some inquiries about your accounts," he said carefully. "Someone claiming to be your daughter, asking about power of attorney requirements. She wanted to know how quickly assets could be transferred with proper documentation." I thanked Marcus, slipped him $20 for his honesty, and left with copies of everything. That evening, while I was organizing all this evidence in the basement workshop where I used to build furniture, my phone rang. Harold Walsh, my lawyer for the past 30 years, sounded concerned. "Tom, I just got the strangest call. Someone asking about your mental capacity, whether you'd ever had any evaluations done. They said they were calling on behalf of your family, worried about your well-being." Harold had handled Margaret's estate, our wills, everything. He knew me better than most. "Tom, in all my years practicing law, I've seen this before. Someone's trying to build a case for guardianship. You need to be very careful." I looked around my workshop, tools all organized exactly how I'd kept them for decades, each one in its place, everything logical and ordered. The rocking chair I'd built for Margaret when Sarah was born sat in the corner, still solid after 35 years. If anyone was losing their mind here, it wasn't me. Harold came by the next morning with a box of documents and a face that meant business. We sat in my living room, the one Margaret had redecorated 3 times before she was satisfied, and he laid out the truth like a surgeon showing you exactly where the cancer had spread. 3 years ago, when Margaret was sick, you signed a power of attorney so Sarah could handle things while you were at the hospital. Remember? I did remember. Those awful weeks when Margaret was fading and I couldn't leave her side. Sarah had been so helpful then, so caring, bringing me coffee, handling the bills, making sure I ate. "That POA was supposed to be temporary," Harold continued, "but it was never officially revoked. Technically, Sarah still has certain powers over your affairs." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Harold wasn't done. "The house is worth $12 million now, Tom. The market in this area has exploded. Your construction company assets, even in retirement, are worth another $3 million. Add in savings, investments, Margaret's life insurance that you never touched, we're talking about close to $20 million. $20 million. I'd never thought of it in those terms. It was just our house, our savings, our life built over 40 years of work. But to Sarah and Michael, drowning in debt with violent creditors circling, it must have looked like salvation. If they could just get me out of the way. "There's a legal process for guardianship," Harold explained, pulling out his reading glasses, the same pair he'd worn to Margaret's funeral. "They'd need to prove mental incompetence. That's where this Dr. Wilson comes in. One diagnosis of dementia or significant cognitive decline, and they could petition the court. With the existing POA and a doctor's evaluation, they'd have a strong case." I thought about all those times recently when Sarah had asked about my memory, whether I was forgetting things, if I needed help managing bills. She'd been building a narrative, creating a paper trail of a concerned daughter worried about her aging father. It was brilliant in its cruelty. That afternoon, I decided to play along. When Sarah called to suggest I see a wonderful doctor who specializes in senior health, I agreed immediately. Could hear the surprise in her voice. "Really, Dad? That's wonderful. Dr. Wilson comes highly recommended." I showed up at Dr. Wilson's office 15 minutes early, wearing my oldest cardigan, the one with the coffee stain I'd been meaning to wash out. I shuffled a bit when I walked, moved slower than necessary, asked the receptionist to repeat things, but I was also recording everything on my phone, hidden in my shirt pocket. When Dr. Wilson came out, a woman about 40 with kind eyes that didn't quite mask her calculation, I was ready. "Mr. Thomas, I understand your daughter is concerned about your memory." I smiled vaguely, then asked her what year it was. Could practically see her writing "confused about time" in her mental notes. The evaluation was almost amusing. I missed obvious questions, but got random difficult ones right, creating an inconsistent pattern that would be hard to diagnose definitively. When she asked about my daily routine, I mentioned Margaret like she was still alive, then caught myself, then looked confused about my confusion. It was exhausting, maintaining that level of calculated deterioration, but necessary. Towards the end, I accidentally let slip that Sarah had been so helpful with my finances lately, managing everything for me. Dr. Wilson's eyes lit up at that. She thought she had her smoking gun. What she actually had was me on record saying Sarah was already controlling my money, which would make her guardianship petition look more like financial exploitation. After the appointment, I sat in my truck in the parking lot, hands shaking slightly. Not from age or illness, but from pure rage. The careful control I'd maintained in that office had cost me something. Playing weak when you're not is its own kind of violence to your soul. But then I listened to the recording on my phone. Dr. Wilson had said things, suggested things that no ethical doctor would say. "Your daughter is very concerned about protecting your assets," she'd said. "Sometimes families need to make hard decisions for everyone's benefit." She'd essentially coached me on what symptoms to display for a dementia diagnosis. I had her. I drove to Frank's house, needing to talk to someone who'd understand. Frank was in his garage, working on an old lawnmower that probably hadn't run since the 90s. "How'd it go?" he asked without looking up. I told him everything. The evaluation, the $20 million motive, the POA trap from 3 years ago. Frank listened, then walked to his workbench and pulled out an old shoebox. "I've been recording every conversation with Sarah for the past month," he said quietly. "She slipped up, Tom. Started asking about my finances too, whether I'd consider a reverse mortgage if I had life insurance. She mentioned you constantly, how worried she was, how you were declining. But last week, she said something interesting. She told me that once you were taken care of, she and Michael could finally pay off his debts and start fresh. She used those exact words, Tom. Taken care of." Frank handed me the box full of tiny recordings, each one labeled with dates and times. "She tried to borrow against my house, too. Forged my signature on a loan application. The only reason it didn't go through is the bank called to verify and got me instead of her." We stood there in Frank's garage. 2 old men surrounded by broken machines we could fix, and broken families we couldn't, holding evidence of our children's betrayal. "Tom," Frank said after a long silence, "I think it's time we stop playing defense." He was right. Sarah and Michael had made their moves. Now it was our turn. Frank and I sat in his kitchen that evening. The recordings spread between us like evidence in a murder trial, which in a way, they were. The murder of trust, of family, of everything I thought I knew about my daughter. "We need more than just these recordings," Frank said, pouring us both whiskey from a bottle he'd been saving since his wife died 5 years ago. "We need a plan that turns their own scheme against them." That's when I told him about Harold, about the POA situation, about playing confused for Dr. Wilson. Frank actually smiled at that last part. "You sly old bastard," he said with something like admiration. "But we need to be smarter. They're desperate, and desperate people do stupid things." The next morning, Harold arrived with reinforcements. Pat Murphy was with him, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better decades. We gathered in my dining room, the one with 12 chairs where only one ever got used anymore. I looked at those empty chairs and remembered Thanksgivings when they were all full. Sarah helping Margaret in the kitchen, Michael carving the turkey like he belonged here. When did it all go wrong? Harold spread out documents, pulling me back to the present. Pat had done more digging. "Michael's in deeper than we thought. The people he owes money to have given him an ultimatum. 30 days to pay, or they start taking payment in other ways. That's why the timeline is so aggressive." Harold nodded, pulling out legal documents. "Here's what we do. First, Tom, you transfer all major assets into an irrevocable trust immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Once it's in the trust, even with guardianship, they can't touch it. I signed where Harold pointed, my hand steady despite everything. Each signature felt like building a wall between my family's legacy and the vultures circling it. The beneficiary? Harold asked. Tommy, I said without hesitation. Everything goes to Tommy when he turns 18, with Frank as trustee if something happens to me. Frank looked surprised, but nodded. The boy was the only innocent in all this. While we worked, Pat set up cameras in my house. Tiny things you'd never notice unless you knew where to look. If they come snooping again, we'll have them on video, he explained. And Tom, I want you to start documenting everything. Every conversation, every visit, everything. 3 days later, Tommy showed up at my door alone. Mom dropped me off, he said, looking uncomfortable. Said I should spend the afternoon with you while she runs errands. I knew immediately something was off. Sarah never just dropped Tommy off. We went to the garage where I was restoring an old chest of drawers, Margaret's first furniture purchase when we got married. She'd found it at a yard sale, painted it yellow, said it would be perfect for our future baby's room. 35 years later, here it was, waiting for another restoration. Tommy watched me work for a while, then pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. Grandpa, he said quietly, I recorded Mom and Dad talking about you. They don't know I heard. My hands stilled on the sandpaper. This 10-year-old boy had more courage than most adults I knew. We went inside, and I plugged the USB into my old laptop. Tommy's voice came through first, explaining he'd left his tablet recording in the living room while his parents thought he was in bed. Then Sarah's voice, clear as day. Once we get him declared incompetent, we can sell the house immediately. The buyer's already interested. 15 million cash. Michael's response was equally damning. The old man won't even know what hit him. By the time he figures it out, he'll be drooling in Sunset Gardens. They laughed. They actually laughed about putting me in a home. But then came something worse. Sarah's voice again. I feel bad about Tommy, though. He really loves his grandfather. Michael's response. He'll get over it. Kids forget fast. Besides, once we have the money, we can give him everything he wants. Tommy was crying quietly beside me. I don't want things, Grandpa. I want you. You're the only one who actually talks to me, who builds things with me. I hugged that boy tight and promised him I wasn't going anywhere. That evening, Harold called with news. Dr. Wilson's report is interesting. She says you show signs of confusion and possible early dementia, but she also notes that you seem to be managing your affairs independently. It's not enough for immediate guardianship. They'd need more evidence. Good. My performance had worked exactly as planned. There's something else, Harold continued. I did some checking on Dr. Wilson. She's been disciplined twice by the medical board for questionable diagnoses in guardianship cases. Always with wealthy elderly patients, always resulting in family members gaining control of assets. She's basically a hired gun. And Tom, I've got the recording you made. She violated about 6 different ethical guidelines in that evaluation. We can bury her with this. Frank came by that night with more recordings and something else. Tom, I hired my own lawyer today. Sarah forged my signature on loan documents. That's federal fraud. I'm pressing charges. I stared at him, shocked. She's my daughter too, in a way, Frank said sadly. Was supposed to be anyway. But what she's doing to you, what she tried to do to me, it's criminal. Maybe facing real consequences will wake her up. Or maybe it'll just stop her from doing this to someone else's father. We sat on my porch, looking at the garden Margaret and I had planted 20 years ago, now overgrown and wild. The tomato plants she'd babied every summer had reseeded themselves, growing wild and untended. Everything we'd built was either dying or trying to destroy us. But we weren't going down without a fight. Tomorrow, Sarah had arranged what she called a family meeting at her house. She'd invited distant relatives, probably to build consensus for her guardianship petition. What she didn't know was that we'd be ready. Harold had prepared documents. Pat had evidence. Frank had recordings. And I had Tommy's USB. The intervention was about to be reversed. I looked at the empty chair beside me, Margaret's chair, and could almost hear her voice. "Give them hell, Tom, but leave room for redemption." Even now, even after everything, she would have looked for the good in Sarah. Maybe that's what I was really fighting for. Not just my freedom, but the chance for Sarah to remember who she used to be. The family meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at Sarah's house, the one I'd helped them buy 5 years ago when Michael's business was supposedly booming. I'd co-signed the loan, given them the down payment as an early inheritance. Now they were using that same house to plan my imprisonment. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best suit, the one from Margaret's funeral. Sharp, dignified, nothing that suggested mental decline. Sarah answered the door, and her face immediately showed confusion. "Dad, you look well?" I smiled and walked past her into the living room, where about 15 relatives had gathered, most of whom I hadn't seen since Margaret's service. Michael stood in the corner, sweating despite the air conditioning. He knew something was off. His phone kept buzzing, and each time he looked at it, his face got paler. Sarah started her performance immediately. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, we're concerned about Dad's well-being. He's been showing signs of confusion, giving away expensive gifts, making strange decisions." She pulled out papers, the Dr. Wilson evaluation, bank statements she'd somehow obtained. "We think it's time to consider assisted living and proper management of his affairs. This isn't about money, it's about safety. Dad needs help, and we want to make sure he gets the best care possible." The relatives murmured sympathetically. Cousin Barbara actually patted my hand like I was already gone. That's when Harold walked in, followed by 2 police officers. The room went dead silent. "Sorry to interrupt," Harold said calmly, "but we have some matters to discuss regarding fraud and elder abuse." Sarah's face went white. Michael actually tried to leave, but one of the officers stepped in front of him. His phone rang again, and this time I could hear the voice on the other end. "Time's up, Mitchell. You've got 24 hours, or we come collecting." Michael's hands were shaking so bad he dropped the phone. Harold continued, pulling out his briefcase. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, you're being investigated for forging your father's signature on admission documents to Sunset Gardens, attempting to access his financial accounts without authorization, and conspiracy to commit elder fraud." He turned to the relatives. "Mr. Thomas is completely competent. In fact, he's been documenting an elaborate scheme to steal his estate." I stood up then, steady and clear. 3 weeks ago, my daughter gave me a GPS tracker hidden in birthday cigars. She's been coming to my house while I'm away, searching through my documents, trying to have me declared incompetent so she and Michael can steal $20 million to pay off gambling debts. The room erupted. Relatives started talking all at once, but I wasn't done. I pulled out Tommy's USB, plugged it into their TV. "Listen to what my daughter says about me when she thinks no one's recording." The recording played, crystal clear on their expensive sound system. Sarah and Michael laughing about putting me in a home, discussing the house sale, calculating how quickly they could liquidate everything. But the worst part was when Sarah said, "The old fool actually thinks I care about him. 3 years of pretending to worry about his health is finally paying off." The room went silent. Cousin Barbara's hand fell away from mine like I was contagious with truth. Sarah was crying now, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of rage at being caught. "You don't understand," she screamed. "They'll kill Michael if we don't pay. They said they'd hurt Tommy." Finally, the truth, or at least part of it. Michael collapsed into a chair, head in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just supposed to be a few bets, but I kept losing, and the interest kept growing. They came to my office, Tom. They knew where Tommy went to school. They knew everything. For a moment, I felt something almost like pity. Then I remembered them laughing about putting me in Sunset Gardens, and the pity evaporated." One of the officers stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, we need you to come with us. There's a warrant for your arrest on fraud charges." Frank had followed through on his threat. As they cuffed Michael, he looked at me with something like relief. Maybe being arrested was better than dealing with his creditors. But then he said something that chilled me. Tom, they said if I don't pay, they'll come after family assets anyway. They know about your house, your accounts. These aren't normal creditors. These are the kind of people who don't stop. The officer led him away, but his words hung in the air. Harold pulled out more papers. Mr. Thomas has transferred all assets to an irrevocable trust. Even if you had succeeded with guardianship, you would have gained nothing. The house, the money, everything is protected. Sarah's legs gave out. She sat on her expensive couch in her expensive house that would probably be seized to pay Michael's debts, and finally understood she'd lost everything, but she had one more card to play. Dad, she said, voice suddenly soft. I'm pregnant. 3 months. Do you really want your grandchild's father in prison? Do you want this baby born while Michael's behind bars? Tommy appeared in the doorway then, having heard the commotion from his room. He looked at his parents, then at me, and made his choice. He walked over and took my hand. Grandpa, is it true? Were they really going to put you in that place? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Tommy turned to his mother. How could you? Grandpa is the only one who cares about me. You're always too busy. Dad's always on his phone, but Grandpa teaches me things. He shows me how to build stuff. He tells me stories about Grandma. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. Tommy, baby, I did this for you. For your future. Tommy shook his head. No, you did it for money. I heard you say so. Can I come stay with you, Grandpa? The relatives filed out quietly, ashamed of their assumption, their readiness to believe I was incompetent. Some muttered apologies. Others just left. Cousin Barbara stopped at the door. Tom, I'm sorry. We should have known better. Sarah called us all, painted this picture of you deteriorating, needing help. We believed her because she's your daughter. We thought she'd know best. I just nodded. What was there to say? The family I'd spent decades building had crumbled in an afternoon. Harold stayed to handle the legal matters. The police took Michael away, and I stood in my daughter's living room, holding my grandson's hand, watching the family I thought I had reveal itself as strangers. Sarah looked up at me one last time. What happens now? She asked. Now you face the consequences, I said. The house will go to pay Michael's debts. You'll probably avoid jail time if you cooperate with the investigation. And Tommy stays with me until you figure out how to be the person your mother would have wanted you to be. I turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and Sarah? Those cigars you gave me? I enjoyed them very much, with Frank. Every single one. It was petty, but sometimes petty is all you have left. 6 months have passed since that afternoon at Sarah's house. I'm sitting on my porch now, watching Tommy help Frank with his garden next door. The boy lives with me during the week, has his own room, the one Sarah used to have, actually. We repainted it together, built model planes, filled it with books. He's a different kid now, laughs more, doesn't look over his shoulder constantly. At dinner, he sits in what used to be Sarah's chair, and somehow that empty space doesn't feel empty anymore. The other 10 chairs are still there, waiting. Maybe someday they'll be filled again with people who actually care about each other, not just about what they can take. Michael's in federal prison, 5 years for fraud and conspiracy. The gambling debts were settled when Sarah sold their house and cars, though she'll be paying restitution for years. The creditors, those wrong people Michael owed, they disappeared once the FBI got involved. Turns out they weren't as untouchable as Michael thought. Sarah lives in a small apartment across town, works 2 jobs at a grocery store, and cleaning offices at night. No more part-time dental office job with flexible hours. This is survival work, the kind that breaks your back and your pride. The letters started coming 2 months ago. First, just short notes, apologizing. Then longer ones, trying to explain. The latest one, 3 pages handwritten on yellow legal pad, sits on my kitchen counter. Dad, therapy is making me face who I became. Dr. Williams says I developed something called complicated grief after Mom died. Instead of processing the loss, I turned it into resentment toward you for still being here when she wasn't. It doesn't excuse what I did, but I'm starting to understand it. I dream about Mom sometimes, and in the dreams she won't look at me. She just keeps turning away. I wake up knowing exactly why. She included a receipt from her therapy sessions, proof she's going twice a week despite barely affording rent. Another paper showing she's volunteering at a senior center on weekends, reading to residents who don't have visitors. I see you in every one of them, she wrote. Men who built things, who provided for families that forgot them. I read to a man named Walter yesterday. His daughter hasn't visited in 2 years. I wanted to call her, scream at her, tell her what she's wasting. Then I realized I was that daughter. The house feels less empty now. Tommy's friends come over, their voices filling rooms that had been silent for too long. We converted Margaret's sewing room into a game room. She would have liked that, seeing the house full of life again. Sometimes I find Tommy in there, looking at the pictures of Margaret I've hung on the walls. She was beautiful, Grandpa, he says. Inside and out, I tell him, just like you're going to be. We cook together in the kitchen, Tommy standing on the same stool Sarah used when she was his age, learning the same recipes Margaret taught her. Sometimes I see flashes of the daughter I used to have in his gestures, his laugh. Maybe that's enough. Frank comes for dinner every Sunday, brings his famous pot roast that's honestly terrible, but we eat it anyway. We smoke cigars on the porch afterward. Real Cubans I bought myself. No GPS trackers needed. He's become the brother I never had, bonded by our children's betrayal and our determination to protect what's left. Last week he told me Sarah had written to him too, apologizing for the forgery, offering to pay him back over time. She's trying, Tom, he said. That's more than most do. I didn't respond, but I kept the letter she'd sent him that he showed me. Dr. Wilson lost her medical license after Frank's lawyer exposed her pattern of false diagnoses. Turns out we weren't her first victims, just her last. Sunset Gardens is under investigation too, kickbacks from families who wanted relatives committed. The whole system Sarah tried to use against me is crumbling, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some satisfaction watching it fall. Pat Murphy still checks in, makes sure no one's bothering us. The cameras are still up too, just in case. You can't be too careful when you've learned how quickly family can become strangers. Last week, Sarah sent a new letter with a photo. She's pregnant, 6 months now, showing clearly. But this letter was different. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for witness. I need someone to see that I'm trying to become someone this baby won't be ashamed of. I work 60 hours a week. I go to therapy. I read parenting books at the laundromat while my clothes dry. I'm learning what it means to earn something instead of taking it. Michael writes from prison, says he's in AA there, finally facing his addiction. We're both broken, Dad, but we're trying to rebuild. Mom used to say, broken things can be beautiful if you fill the cracks with gold. I'm trying to find my gold. Tommy found the ultrasound photo before I could decide what to do with it. Is this my brother or sister? He asked. I nodded. He studied it for a long moment, then walked to the refrigerator and put it up with a magnet, right next to Margaret's picture from our 40th anniversary. Grandma would want the baby to have a chance, he said simply. This kid, wise beyond his 10 years, already understanding mercy better than most adults. The two photos sit there now, side by side, the past and the future, loss and possibility. Margaret's smile watching over a grandchild she'll never meet but somehow still protects. I've started a foundation with some of the money, helping elderly people who've been victims of family fraud. You'd be amazed how common it is. Children treating parents like ATMs. Love becoming leverage. Harold runs it now. Says we've helped 43 families so far. It's something good from something terrible. Margaret would have called it finding light in darkness. The house is being converted too slowly. After I'm gone, it'll become a community center, a place for seniors to gather, to watch out for each other. Tommy thinks it's cool his inheritance includes helping people. That's how I know we're raising him right. People ask me if I've forgiven Sarah. The truth is, forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a daily choice, and some days I choose it, some days I don't. But I've learned something important through all this. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand by you when standing by you costs them something. It's Frank recording conversations to protect me. It's Harold working overtime to save my assets. It's Pat investigating without being asked. It's Tommy choosing truth over comfort. And maybe someday, it'll be Sarah again, rebuilt from the ground up, the daughter Margaret believed she could be. Yesterday, I wrote my first letter back to Sarah. Just one line. Send me the ultrasound from your next appointment. It's not forgiveness, not yet, but it's a start. Tommy saw me mail it. Smiled like he knew something I didn't. Maybe he does. Kids see hope where adults see history. Tonight, I stand in my kitchen, looking at those 2 photos on the refrigerator. Margaret at 40, radiant and laughing. Her future grandchild in black and white, waiting to be born. The space between them feels like a bridge I'm not ready to cross. But maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to build it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to hear more stories like this. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've experienced something similar.